The first thing that hit me wasn't the sight of the unfamiliar silver sedan parked where Dad always left his old Ford pickup. It wasn't even the eerie glow of lights from windows that should have been dark for the last 6 months. No, it was the smell. Instead of the cabin's true scent, that rich, sacred mix of old pine, lake water, and the faint, lingering ghost of my father's pipe tobacco, the air was sharp, sterile. It smelled of lemon polish and something vaguely, sickeningly floral. It was the smell of erasure, the smell of a memory being scrubbed clean. My hand, holding the key that now felt like a foreign object, trembled slightly. This place was supposed to be my sanctuary, the one corner of the world still holding the echo of my father after his accident. Coming back here was meant to be a pilgrimage, a quiet sorting of a life well lived. But this felt like a violation. I pushed the door open. The living room was a ghost of itself. Dad's worn leather armchair, molded to the shape of his body over 30 years of reading and dozing, was gone. In its place stood a sterile white sofa that looked like it belonged in a high-end dentist's office. The bookshelves, once overflowing with his collection of history books and dog-eared paperbacks, were now sparsely decorated with generic hardcovers, arranged by color instead of content. Vases filled with offensively cheerful flowers sat on surfaces that were once cluttered with fishing lures and coffee rings. And then I saw her. She stood by the great stone fireplace, back to me, directing 2 men who were carefully mounting a piece of abstract art where a framed map of the lake used to hang. She was tall, slender, dressed in a crisp white blazer and impeccably tailored slacks. She moved with an unnerving, predatory grace, a creature of the city released into the heart of the woods. "A little to the left," she commanded, her voice as cool and smooth as Riverstone. "It needs to catch the afternoon light." The anger that had been simmering in my gut ignited into a hot flame. It burned away the grief and shock, leaving only pure, focused rage. "Who the hell are you?" She turned slowly. There was no surprise in her eyes, no alarm, just a placid, chilling curiosity. She looked me up and down, a flicker of something like amusement on her perfectly composed face. "Ah, Mr. Reyes," she said, her voice dripping with a politeness that was more insulting than any curse. "Alex, is it? You're back a bit sooner than anticipated." "I asked you a question," I said, my voice low and tight. "What are you doing in my father's house?" "Your father's house?" She let out a small, delicate laugh. "My dear boy, this is an asset, a property, and a severely under-optimized one, at that. I am Eleanor Vance, and my company, Vance Lakefront Properties, is simply ensuring this asset meets its full market potential as per the Pine Lake Community Covenant." "There is no Pine Lake Community Covenant," I shot back. "My father owned this land, free and clear. Now get out, all of you, before I call the sheriff." Eleanor Vance simply smiled. It was a terrifying sight, all teeth and no warmth. Then she did something that completely unmoored me from reality. She reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out a sleek smartphone, and tapped the screen with a perfectly manicured nail. She held the phone to her ear, her cool blue eyes never leaving mine. 911, what's your emergency?" I heard the tinny voice of the operator. Eleanor's entire demeanor shifted. Her voice, once so commanding, became a trembling, fragile whisper. It was a masterful performance. "Yes, hello, my name is Eleanor Vance. I'm at 12 Lakeview Drive." Her eyes, full of calculated fear, were locked on me. There's a man here. He broke in. He seems very agitated. Very unstable." I stood there, paralyzed, listening to this woman steal my home and then paint me as the villain in a story she was inventing on the spot. "Yes, he's yelling. I'm concerned he might become violent. His name? I think it's Alex Reyes. He's the son of the previous owner. I believe he may have some mental health issues related to his father's passing." The world tilted on its axis. She was using my grief, my father's death, as a weapon against me. 10 minutes later, the crunch of gravel announced the arrival of a patrol car. Deputy Miller stepped out. He was a man I'd known since I was a kid, a man who'd once shared a beer with my father on that very porch. But the man who walked through the door wasn't a neighbor. He was the law, and his eyes were cold and wary. He nodded respectfully to Eleanor. "Ma'am." Then he turned to me. "Alex, what's going on here? Ms. Vance called, said you were trespassing, making threats." "Trespassing?" I could hear the desperation in my own voice. "Miller, this is my house. My father left it to me. This woman is the trespasser." Eleanor stepped forward, clutching a sleek leather portfolio. "Deputy, I understand his emotional state, but the situation is quite clear." She opened the portfolio, revealing a stack of documents filled with official-looking letterheads and signatures. "According to the Community Association bylaws, a property left vacant for 6 months falls under association management to prevent neglect and maintain property values. It's all here." "That's insane! There is no association!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Son, I'm going to need you to calm down," Miller said, his hand moving instinctively closer to the butt of his gun. His gaze shifted from me to the wild-eyed, disheveled man I must have appeared to be, and then to the calm, composed, well-dressed woman holding a folder of what looked like perfectly legal documents. I had nothing. The deed, the will, it was all in a safe deposit box at a bank 100 miles away. All I had was a key in my pocket and a rage in my heart. Against her performance, it meant nothing. "I'm sorry, Alex," Miller said, his tone final, "but this appears to be a civil matter. For now, given the situation, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the property." "Leave?" The word felt like acid in my mouth. "You're kicking me out of my own home?" "Just until you can get this sorted out with the courts," he said, avoiding my eyes. "It's for the best. De-escalate the situation." As he led me toward the door, a stranger escorting me from my own life, I looked back. Eleanor Vance was standing by the large picture window, watching me go. There was no triumph in her expression, no emotion at all. It was the detached, placid look of a biologist observing a specimen after it had been neutralized. It was in that moment, as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, that the cold, terrifying truth finally settled in my bones. This wasn't about a property dispute. This wasn't about bylaws or contracts. This was a hunt, and I had just been flushed out of my own den. Exile. That's the only word for it. Driving away from your own home, with the accusing stare of a corrupt deputy in your rearview mirror and the triumphant silhouette of a predator in the window. I didn't drive far, just to the edge of town, to a place called the Sleepy Pine Motel. The neon sign flickered, casting a sickly green glow on the peeling paint. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and despair. It was the polar opposite of the clean, pine-scented air of the cabin, and that irony felt like another twist of the knife. I collapsed onto the lumpy bed, the events of the day playing over and over in my head like a film reel from hell. The false smile of Eleanor Vance, the practiced fear in her voice as she spoke to the 911 operator, Deputy Miller's dismissive gaze. It was all so smooth, so rehearsed. This wasn't the first time she'd done this. The thought chilled me more than the rattling air conditioner in the corner. How many other people had she erased from their own lives with a folder of forged documents and a confident lie? Sleep didn't come. I just lay there, staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the rumble of trucks on the highway, a man locked out of his own past. The next morning, the sun rose with a kind of cruel indifference. I needed coffee. I needed a plan. I needed to call a lawyer. I walked out into the cool morning air, fumbling for my car keys, and stopped dead. My front right tire was flat, but it wasn't just flat. There was no nail, no slow leak. There was a clean, deliberate gash in the sidewall, about 3 inches long, a wound inflicted with a sharp blade. It wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. It was a message. Stay down. Stay away. The fog of my grief and confusion was burned away by a sudden sharp clarity. The hook from part 1 wasn't just a metaphor. This wasn't about getting me out of the house anymore. This was about keeping me out. Permanently. And they were watching me. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. The quiet motel suddenly felt like a stage, and I was the only actor who didn't know his lines. My mind raced. A lawyer would take days, weeks. They'd file motions. Eleanor Vance would file counter motions. She'd bury me in paperwork and legal fees until I was broken. That was her game. A war of attrition. I couldn't win that way. I needed something else. I needed leverage. I needed the truth. And then I thought of her. The Sentinel of the Lake, my father used to call her. Marta Petrov. Marta lived 2 cabins down from ours. She was a Polish immigrant who had seen more of the world's darkness than most, and had chosen the quiet solitude of the lake to live out her days. She was private, reclusive, and fiercely protective of her peace. But my father, he had earned her trust. They'd share coffee on her porch sometimes, speaking in low tones, 2 old souls who understood the value of silence. If anyone knew anything, it was her. Her cabin was like a small fortress. The curtains were drawn tight, the yard meticulously kept but unwelcoming. It took 3 firm knocks before the door opened, just a crack. A sliver of a pale, wrinkled face and a single, suspicious blue eye peered out. "What you want?" Her voice was raspy, thick with an accent that had softened but never disappeared. "Marta, it's me, Alex Reyes, Jim's son." The eye widened slightly, a flicker of recognition, followed immediately by fear. The door started to close. "Please," I said, putting my hand up, not on the door, but just in the space between us. A gesture of peace. "Please, I need to talk to you. It's about my father. It's about the cabin. I have nothing to say," she whispered, her voice tight. "You should not be here. Go away." "They kicked me out, Marta," I said, my voice low. "A woman named Eleanor Vance. She's taken over the house." At the mention of that name, the blood drained from her face. She tried to slam the door, but I held my ground. "Marta, please. They slashed my tire this morning. They're threatening me. I think they did something to my father." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and terrifying. "They killed him, didn't they, Marta?" The fight went out of her. The door sagged open. She looked left, then right, down the empty dirt road, as if expecting assassins to leap from the woods. Then she pulled me inside with surprising strength and bolted the door behind us. The inside of her cabin was the opposite of mine. It was dark, cluttered with old-world furniture, lace doilies, and the heavy smell of cabbage soup and beeswax. It felt safe, like a place forgotten by time. She led me to a small kitchen table and poured 2 glasses of tea with a trembling hand. For a long moment, she just stared into her cup. "Your father," she began, her voice barely audible. "He was a good man, a brave man, too brave." "What do you mean? What was he doing?" She looked up, her eyes meeting mine. They were filled with a deep, ancient sorrow. "Your father. He was not just a schoolteacher who liked to fish, Alex. Not really. In the old country, before he came here, and even here, when he was young, he was a man who wrote down the truth. A man who asked questions that powerful people did not want answered. An investigative journalist. The pieces started to click into place. The late nights in his study. The endless books on corporate law and political history. I'd always thought they were just a hobby. "He was retired," I said weakly. "A man like your father never truly retires," she countered. "He put down his pen, but his eyes were always open. He saw what this Vance woman was doing. Not just here, all around the state, buying up land, pushing people out with fake legal papers, promising developments that never came. He saw the pattern." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She is not just a real estate woman, Alex. She is a rot, a poison in the land. She finds places like this, quiet places, full of good people who trust each other, and she turns them into money. She launders it, you see, takes dirty money from bad men and makes it clean by building nothing, just moving papers around. And my dad found out. She nodded slowly. He found out. He spent months digging. He told me, just a week before the accident. He said, "Marta, I almost have it. I almost have the proof to burn her whole empire to the ground." My heart was pounding in my chest. Proof? What proof? Where is it? He would not tell me exactly, for my safety. He just said he kept it all in a place only he could find, a place that was fireproof, waterproof, thief-proof, a secret inside the cabin. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and awe. He had a ledger, Alex, names, dates, bank accounts, and a small memory stick, a USB. He said it was the key to everything. He said it connected Eleanor Vance to men you would not want to meet in a dark alley or on a mountain road. The implication was a physical blow, the brakes failing, the car plunging into the ravine. It wasn't a tragic accident, it was a silencing. Eleanor Vance wasn't just staging my father's house to rent it out. She wasn't just trying to steal a piece of property. She was hunting for the evidence that could destroy her. She was sanitizing a crime scene. And I had just stumbled right into the middle of it. I stood up, the teacup rattling in its saucer. The world had shifted on its axis. The grief for my father was still there, a raw, open wound. But now it was joined by a new emotion, something cold and hard and dangerous. It was rage, forged into the shape of a weapon. My mission was no longer just to get my house back. It was to find that safe, to unearth that ledger and that USB drive, to finish what my father had died for. I walked to the door, my mind clear for the first time in days. Marta looked at me, her face a mask of worry. "Be careful, Alex. She is a snake, and she is not alone." "I know," I said, turning to give her a small, grateful nod. But she made one mistake. She thought this was just another piece of property. I stepped out into the daylight, the world now sharp and defined. The trees were no longer just trees. They were cover. The lake was no longer just water, it was a silent witness. The cabin was no longer just a home, it was a vault, and I was going to get inside. My father started this fight. Now it was up to me to finish it. Leaving Marta's cabin, I felt like a different man. The grief was still there, a cold, heavy stone in my gut, but it was no longer a fog of confusion. It had been forged into a point, sharp and clear. My father didn't just leave me a house, he left me a mission, and I, his son, would not fail him. My first instinct, the one drilled into every law-abiding citizen, was to try the system one last time, if only to prove to myself how broken it was. From a payphone outside a dusty gas station, because I was suddenly paranoid about my own cell phone, I called the sheriff's office. I didn't ask for Miller. I asked to file a formal report regarding suspicious circumstances around my father's death and the illegal occupation of his property. The dispatcher who answered sounded bored. She put me on hold for 5 minutes, the tinny music grating on my already frayed nerves. Finally, she came back on the line. "Sir," she said, her voice flat, "Deputy Miller has already filed a report on the dispute at 12 Lakeview Drive. It's a civil matter. You'll need to contact a lawyer. As for your other allegations, you'll need to provide concrete evidence before we can open an investigation." "The evidence is in the house," I said through clenched teeth. "A house I'm legally barred from entering." "Then you'll need a court order, sir," she replied, and the line went dead. That was it. The door was officially slammed in my face. The system wasn't just failing to help me, it was actively protecting her. I was on my own. I drove back to the Sleepy Pine Motel, my mind a whirlwind of impossible plans. I'm an architect. I design things. I work with blueprints and building codes. I didn't know the first thing about breaking into a house, cracking a safe or taking on a criminal enterprise. My father was the spy, the man who knew how to navigate the shadows. I was just a son, trying to honor his memory, completely and utterly out of my depth. That evening, as I was staring blankly at a satellite map of the cabin on my laptop in the motel's dingy lobby, a voice cut through my thoughts. "Rough day for Wi-Fi, huh?" I looked up. A young man, maybe in his mid-20s, stood there with a friendly grin. He was wearing a hoodie with a tech company logo I didn't recognize. "Saw you at the coffee shop earlier. You're the guy, right? The one who got kicked out of the old Reyes place." I tensed up, my hand instinctively closing the laptop. "Who's asking?" "Whoa, hey, easy there," he said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Name's Caleb. I live a few cabins down the road. Just wanted to say what that Vance woman is doing. It's disgusting. A corporate vulture picking over the bones of a good man's legacy." His words were so aligned with my own thoughts that it disarmed me. "You have no idea," I muttered. "Oh, I think I do," he said, pulling up a chair. "I've seen her operation. The fancy cars, the shady-looking investors. It's a classic land grab scheme. My generation. We see this stuff online all the time." He leaned in, his voice dropping. "Listen, man, you can't fight someone like that with lawyers. You gotta fight her with her own tools, technology, information." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. "What do you mean?" "I'm a software developer," he said with a proud grin. "I've got gear, a high-res drone, signal jammers, software that can analyze security patterns. If you want to know what's really going on in that house, I can help you see it." It seemed too good to be true. A tech-savvy ally appearing out of nowhere, offering the exact skill set I desperately needed. But I was drowning, and he was throwing me a rope. I had to grab it. For the next 2 days, my motel room became a war room. Caleb was a whirlwind of energy and ideas. He set up his laptop next to mine, the glow of the screens illuminating our faces in the dark. He showed me grainy, but clear, drone footage of the cabin. We saw Eleanor's silver sedan coming and going. We saw the big, burly man who seemed to be her bodyguard or enforcer. We saw them carrying equipment into the house. "They're looking for something," I told Caleb, deciding to trust him with a piece of the truth. "My dad hid something there, something that could ruin her." Caleb's eyes lit up. "A real-life treasure hunt. This is incredible. We'll get it back, man." I promise his enthusiasm was infectious. The crushing weight of my isolation began to lift. We weren't just two guys in a motel room. We were a resistance. We mapped out the cabin's layout from my memory. We identified blind spots in the new security cameras Eleanor had installed, cameras Caleb's drone had spotted. From the drone footage, we learned that Eleanor was planning a big meeting on Friday night. A group of her partners were flying in. "That's our window," Caleb said, pointing at the screen. "They'll all be in the main living room, distracted. And there's a storm front moving in. Perfect cover." The plan was born. I would go in during the storm, using the cover of darkness and the noise of the thunder. I'd use the secret basement entrance, find the safe behind the fireplace, get the evidence, and get out. Caleb would be my eyes in the sky, monitoring their movements with the drone and feeding me information through a small earpiece. It was risky. It was insane. But it was the only shot I had. On Thursday afternoon, the day before the mission, Caleb said he needed to drive into the next town to pick up a more powerful battery for the drone. "Gotta be prepared for anything," he said with a wink. I stayed behind, my heart thrumming with a nervous energy that was equal parts fear and hope. To calm my nerves, I powered up the drone feed on my own laptop. Just watching the silent, unmoving image of the cabin, it was peaceful. Deceptively so. I spent an hour just watching the trees sway, my mind running through the plan again and again. Then I saw movement, not at the house, but at the edge of the woods near the old logging trail. I zoomed in, the image pixelating slightly. It was Caleb. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be miles away. And he wasn't alone. He was talking to the big, burly man from the drone footage, Eleanor's enforcer. My blood ran cold. I watched, my breath caught in my throat as the two men spoke. I couldn't hear them, but I didn't need to. I saw the enforcer hand Caleb a thick white envelope. Caleb took it, nodded, and patted the man on the shoulder before turning and walking back toward his car. The laptop screen seemed to swim before my eyes, the friendly grin, the righteous anger, the drone footage, the perfectly timed offer of help, a performance, every piece of it, every shared secret, every late-night planning session. He hadn't been my partner. He had been my confessor, funneling every one of my intentions, my fears, and my plans directly to the enemy. He wasn't throwing me a rope. He was measuring me for a noose. I was alone again, but this time was worse. This time I was completely, utterly exposed. They knew I was coming. They knew how I was coming. They knew what I was looking for. The trap was set, my own trap. And now I had no choice but to walk right into it and pray I could find a different way out. The drone feed on the laptop screen seemed to mock me with its silent, damning evidence. The friendly face of Caleb, my supposed ally, flashed in my mind, his earnest promises now turning to ash in my memory. For a long, hollow moment in that stale motel room, the fight went out of me. It was one thing to be fighting an enemy you could see. It was another to realize you'd been cheerfully handing your sword to them the entire time. Every plan we'd made, every vulnerability I'd shared, it was all known. The basement entrance, the timing, my goal. It wasn't a plan anymore. It was an invitation to my own execution. I sank onto the edge of the lumpy mattress, the weight of it all pressing down on me. Maybe this was it. Maybe I was meant to just walk away, let her have the house, let the memory of my father be buried under a mountain of her lies. It would be the sane thing to do, the safe thing to do. But then I pictured her face. That cold, confident smile. I pictured her walking through my father's home, touching his things with her sterile, manicured hands. And I pictured my father spending his last months not in peaceful retirement, but in a secret war against her, a war that had cost him his life. Sanity be damned, safety be damned. Rage, pure and cold, flooded back into my veins, pushing out the despair. She had taken my ally. She had taken my plan. She would not take my resolve. I swept the useless earpiece and Caleb's notes off the table and into the trash. I was going in, but not as Caleb's pawn. I was going in blind, alone, the way my father had fought. And I wouldn't use the plan she was expecting. The storm broke just after 10 o'clock, hitting the mountains with a primal fury. The wind howled through the pines, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, smelling of ozone and wet earth. This was my cover. I left the motel and drove my rental car to a logging trail a mile away from the cabin, hiding it deep in the underbrush. I moved through the woods, the forest floor dark and treacherous under my feet. This was the way Dad and I used to hike, following deer trails instead of marked paths. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Was that Kovac, her burly henchman, waiting in the shadows? Was Caleb watching on a monitor somewhere, laughing? I pushed the paranoia down. I had to trust my father's woods. When I reached the clearing, the cabin was a dark silhouette against the bruised purple sky, its windows like vacant eyes. A single generator-powered floodlight cast long, dancing shadows across the yard, aimed directly at the basement entrance. A welcome mat for a fool. They would never expect me to come from above. To the left of the house stood the old oak tree, its thick branches like gnarled arms reaching for the sky. High up, barely visible, was the rotting platform of the treehouse Dad and I had built when I was 10. From there, one long, thick branch stretched out, almost touching the balcony of my father's second-floor bedroom. It was a route born of childhood imagination, now my only path forward. The climb was a nightmare. The bark was slick with rain, the wind trying to tear me from my grip. My muscles screamed. Halfway up, my foot slipped, and I dangled for a terrifying moment, the rocky ground seeming to leap up at me. I clung on, my cheek pressed against the rough bark, my heart hammering against my ribs. You can do this! For him! Finally, I hauled myself onto the balcony, gasping for air, soaked to the bone. The sliding door was locked, but it was old. Using the blade of my pocket knife, my father's old pocket knife, I worked the simple latch for a minute before it clicked open. I slipped inside, melting into the shadows of the room where my father used to sleep. The house was unnaturally silent, save for the symphony of the storm outside. And then I heard it. Voices from downstairs. "Still no sign of him at the basement door," a man's gruff voice rumbled. "Kovac. Maybe the little rat got spooked." "He'll come," Eleanor's voice replied, sharp and impatient. "Men like him, driven by sentiment and revenge. They're predictable. He believes there's something here worth dying for. Let him. Just find that safe before he does." My blood ran cold. They were actively searching. This wasn't just a trap. It was a race. I moved out of the bedroom, my socked feet making no sound on the old wooden floors. I was a ghost in my own home. I knew every board that creaked, every door that whined. I crept down the hallway, my back pressed against the wall, peering over the banister. In the flickering light of their powerful flashlights, I could see them below. Kovac was methodically tapping the walls around the living room, while Eleanor stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed, directing him like a general. I had to get down there. Waiting for a loud clap of thunder to cover my movement, I slipped down the stairs, ducking into the small coat closet under the staircase, a hiding spot from 1,000 childhood games of hide and seek. I held my breath as Kovac's heavy footsteps passed just inches from the door. The beam of his flashlight cut through the crack under the door, a brilliant white line of danger. He paused. My heart stopped. Had he heard me? He grunted, then moved on. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. They were focused on the walls, on the floor. They were looking for a conventional safe. They didn't know my father. They didn't know his love for history, for secrets, for the cleverness of old-world stonemasons. I waited until they moved into the dining room. It was my only chance. I darted from the closet to the massive stone fireplace that dominated the living room. My hands, slick with sweat and rain, ran over the familiar, rough-hewn stones. It had been a game he'd taught me. Every castle has its secrets, Alex. 4th stone from the left, 3rd row from the mantel. My fingers found the slight give. I pushed. A low grinding sound, almost lost in the storm's roar, echoed in the room as a section of the stone facade recessed into the wall, revealing a small, dark metal door. The safe. My fingers fumbled with the combination dial. My own birthday. A heavy thunk echoed as the lock disengaged. I swung the door open. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a thick leather-bound ledger and a single silver USB drive. I had it. "Thank you, Alex." Eleanor's voice was right behind me. Cold. Victorious. I spun around. She was standing in the doorway of the dining room, a small, cruel smile on her face. Kovac blocked the other exit. I was trapped. "You've saved me a great deal of trouble," she said, stepping forward. "I admit your father was clever, but sentiment, it's always a fatal flaw. Now hand it over." Kovac started toward me, his massive hands flexing. My mind raced. There was no way out, no escape. Then my eyes darted to the right of the fireplace, to the decorative piece that had been there for as long as I could remember, a grim historical artifact my father had bought at an auction, a heavy antique bear trap, its metal jaws rusted but still menacing. It was a part of the house, a part of my past. It was my only hope. As Kovac lunged, I didn't run. I shoved the heavy armchair next to me directly into his path. He stumbled, roaring in frustration. In that split second, I grabbed the ledger and the USB drive, and then did the last thing they expected. I dove sideways toward the fireplace. "Get him!" Eleanor shrieked. Kovac recovered his balance and charged, his eyes fixed on me. He didn't see what I was doing. With all my strength, I kicked out with my foot, not at him, but at the bear trap, sending it skidding across the polished wooden floor directly into his path. He never saw it. His heavy boot came down right on the pressure plate. The sound was sickening. A loud metallic snap echoed through the room, followed by a scream of pure, unadulterated agony that was even louder than the thunder outside. Eleanor stared in horror at her writhing henchman. That was the only opening I needed. I scrambled to my feet, clutching my father's legacy to my chest, and sprinted for the far side of the room. I didn't even try the door. With a desperate roar, I threw my shoulder against the large paned window. The glass shattered, exploding out into the storm. I tumbled through the frame, landing hard on the wet grass and rolling, the shards of glass tearing at my jacket. Behind me, I could hear Eleanor's scream of fury, a sound of a predator whose prey had just been ripped from its jaws. I didn't look back. I just ran, disappearing into the howling darkness of my father's woods. I didn't stop running until the burning in my lungs felt like fire and the edges of my vision began to swim. The fury of the storm was my shield, its roaring chaos swallowing any sound of pursuit. My jacket was torn, my arms stung with a dozen small cuts from the shattered glass, and a warm trickle of blood ran from my temple into my eye, but I didn't care. In my right hand, clutched with a grip of iron, were my father's weapons, a worn leather ledger and a single silver USB drive. I burst out of the woods onto the logging trail a mile from the cabin, my rental car, a welcome, mundane sight in the heart of the tempest. I didn't fumble for the keys. I didn't look back. I got in, cranked the engine, and peeled out onto the empty county road, the tires spinning on the wet asphalt. My instincts screamed at me to drive as fast and as far as I could, but I didn't drive aimlessly. I drove past the turnoff to the Sleepy Pine Motel. I drove past the edge of town, leaving the dim lights and its web of corruption behind me. I got on the interstate and pointed the car east, toward the distant glow of the city. There would be no more local calls, no more trusting in a system that Eleanor Vance had so clearly bought and paid for. I had learned my lesson in the most brutal way possible. Deputy Miller wasn't just a lazy cop. He was a gatekeeper. Caleb wasn't just a traitor. He was a spy. This wasn't something you could fix with a local complaint. You don't ask one spider to investigate another in the same web. You burn the whole web down. The drive was a 4-hour blur of highway hypnosis, fueled by stale gas station coffee and the last dregs of adrenaline. The ledger and the USB drive sat on the passenger seat beside me, a sacred inheritance. With every mile that passed, the fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, resolute calm. I was no longer prey. I was a messenger, carrying my father's final story. I arrived at the J. Edgar Hoover building in the city, just as the first grey light of dawn was breaking through the bruised post-storm clouds. I must have been a sight, soaked to the bone, caked in mud, with a bleeding cut on my forehead. I probably looked like the villain of a story, not the hero. The 2 FBI agents who met me in the sterile interview room certainly thought so. They were polite, professional, but their eyes were full of cautious skepticism. They listened to my wild tale of a stolen inheritance, a corrupt deputy, and a shadowy conspiracy with the patient air of men who had heard every crazy story imaginable. I could see the disbelief hardening in their faces. Then I pushed the evidence across the steel table. "This is what my father died for," I said, my voice hoarse. The senior agent, a man named Harris, picked up the leather ledger first. He opened it. His eyes, tired and cynical a moment before, sharpened. He scanned the pages, a catalogue of names, offshore accounts, and illicit transactions. He then took the USB drive, inserted it into his laptop, and his face became a mask of grim concentration. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the room was the quiet click of his keyboard. Finally, he looked up, not at me, but at his partner, and in that single look, everything changed. The skepticism was gone, replaced by the intense focus of a hunter who has just caught the scent of his quarry. "Get Agent DeLuca and his team," Harris said, his voice low and urgent. "White-collar crime. Tell them to cancel their morning plans and get the U.S. attorney for this district on the phone. Now!" He turned to me, and for the first time, I felt like someone actually saw me. "Mr. Reyes," he said, his voice now full of a grave respect, "why don't you tell us everything from the very beginning?" And so I did. They put me up in a secure hotel. The waiting was its own kind of torture. The long, silent hours stretched on, a stark contrast to the frantic terror of the night before. I didn't know when they would move or how. I just had to trust that the wheels of a justice far greater than Deputy Miller's were finally beginning to turn. 2 days later, just before dawn, I knew. It was a gut feeling. I checked out of the hotel, drove back towards the lake, and parked on a high wooded ridge overlooking the cabin, the same spot where Caleb had betrayed me. The world was washed clean by the storm. The air was crisp, the sky a gentle, promising blue. It was peaceful. Then I saw them, not with a roar of sirens, but like ghosts, a convoy of black, unmarked SUVs moving silently down the road. They surrounded the property with a terrifying, professional efficiency. I raised my binoculars. I saw agents in black tactical gear deploy from the vehicles, moving with a synchronized grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. They didn't knock. A battering ram splintered the new front door Eleanor had installed. They flooded into the house. It was over in minutes. The first person they brought out was Caleb. He looked pale and bewildered, his tech-savvy arrogance completely gone, replaced by the pathetic fear of a child caught in a game too big for him. Then they brought out Kovac, his leg in a massive cast, his face a mask of dull pain. And finally, they brought her out. Eleanor Vance. Her white blazer was rumpled, her perfect hair was a mess. As they put the handcuffs on her, her mask of cool, untouchable authority finally completely shattered. In the clear morning light, she wasn't a queen or a predator. She was just a criminal, exposed and defeated. Later that day, I heard that Deputy Miller had been taken into custody from his own office. The web had been burned to the ground. A week later, I stood on the porch of my father's cabin. It had been cleared by the FBI, the broken window boarded up, the ridiculous white furniture now gone. It was quiet. It was empty. It was mine. I held a framed photo I'd found on my father's nightstand. It was of the two of us standing right on this porch 20 years ago. I was a goofy kid with a missing tooth. He had his arm around me, a proud, loving smile on his face. The grief, once so sharp, now felt different. It was still there, but it was softer, mingled with pride and a deep, aching love. The lake was calm, the water like glass. The scent of pine was back. A sense of peace, weary and hard-won, settled over me for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. I had won. I had honored him. The fight was over. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. A text message from a number I didn't recognize. My heart gave a sudden hard lurch. The message had only 7 words. "You should have taken the money." I stared at the screen, the words seeming to burn into my eyes. The peaceful scene around me dissolved. Eleanor was gone. Miller was gone. But they weren't the source of the rot. They were just branches. The roots went deeper into a darkness I couldn't yet see. I looked up from the phone out at the vast, silent lake. The fight for my father's cabin was over, but the fight for his legacy was just beginning.